Good evening, everyone. Thank you for spending your Friday with us at the Art Center. If I haven't had a chance to meet you, although I know most people in the room, my name is Kinsey Robb, and I am the Executive Director here at the Art Center, which is just a wonderful privilege to have. And we're here kicking off our first cycle of the season, and of course the first of the beginning of our artist series. So last night we had Zach Gilliland in the house, and tonight we have Randy Globus. I'd like to thank our exhibitions department, Christina Burrell and Cassie Andrews, for not only organizing the show, but organizing all these discussions that we have for all of our exhibiting artists. Tonight, we welcome Randy, who is a remarkable artist, if you can't already tell from the works in the room. And her watercolor paintings serve as, I think, a captivating visual autobiography. Through her work, Randy skillfully weaves together a narrative of her life and those around her through traditional histories of puppeteering, spinning it into a unique and imaginative access point for reflection. Randy creates avatars that playfully and, at times with profound seriousness, delve into the realms of reality and the subconsciousness. The numerous layers of watercolor breathe life and dimensionality into these avatars, exploring the depths of her experiences, emotions, surroundings, and perceptions. With a vivid and fluid brushstroke, Randy invites us on a journey to the intricacies of her existence, offering a profound glimpse into the intersections of the real and the unseen, welcoming us into a world where art transcends traditional boundaries, revealing the profound story of a life lived and imagined. So please join me in welcoming Randy and Cassie for what surely is going to be a wonderful discussion, followed with a brief Q&A. Thank you.
All right. It's great to see you again, Randy.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So I figured we could kind of start in the beginning a little bit. You grew up in New York, and you got involved in the arts at a fairly early age. You even had an internship at the Met in high school.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could tell us just a little bit about your introduction into the art world.
You mean starting kind of from that point or early childhood?
I guess whichever one you're feeling.
Okay. When I was like very young, maybe around 5, and I don't know where I got this idea, but I said to my parents, when I grow up, I want to be an artist like Leonardo da Vinci. And I don't even know where I got that idea. You know, little kid knowing Leonardo da Vinci. But my parents got me an easel, and we lived in a one-bedroom rent-controlled apartment in Queens, and where my sister and I had this room, it really was supposed to be like the dinette, and my parents closed off this wall, and that was our room. But my parents let me artistically do whatever I wanted to do. They let me paint on the walls. Wow. You know, but I never made a mess. Like I was always very mindful of what I was doing. It was very intentional. I wasn't like running around scribbling. I had a plan and laid it out and did it. And they never said a discouraging word. You know, the only time my mother said a discouraging word was when it came time to go to high school. New York City has these special schools, and I wanted to go to the High School of Art and Design. And they're free, but you have to qualify. So you have to show a portfolio and take a test and all that. And my mother she was pretty upset about it because she was afraid that I'd never be able to make a living. which turned out like to be totally not true. Because when you follow your passion, you tend to fall into the right places at the right time. And that always happened for me. So I was very lucky. There were times in my life I did graphic arts, there were times that I taught, but I was always doing something that connected to my artwork.
Yeah, very well put. So on you being a teacher, you were a teacher for years. How do you think that that has affected your art, and what have you taken away from that experience?
Well, a lot of times I saw how kids had their own approach of how to solve a problem, because basically when you're making a piece of art, you're always saying to yourself, I say to myself when I do every painting, like, how am I going to do that? For example, you see my avatar, the little girl here, and she's got like this dress on that's shiny. The paint isn't shiny. So I say to myself, okay, how am I going to make that look like it's shiny? Because it's really an illusion. And I saw, kids taking different approaches as to how are they going to do something. So that informed me. And I think also when you're teaching, and I would have a couple of hundred students throughout the course of the day, and you're doing demos to show them how to work with various materials, you become really astute at just the technical aspect of how to do something. You do it a million times a day, you become pretty good at it. So that was very helpful also.
Yeah, definitely. You see where kids' unbridled creativity would be very inspiring.
Yeah.
Are there any artists or performers or any other places you draw inspiration from?
I draw inspiration from a lot of things. From puppeteers. My earliest influences really were from Shari Lewis and Lamb Chop. And it fascinated me because I saw, it wasn't like I didn't know that this was a puppet, but I would remember saying to myself, like, she's talking to herself. And I found that like very fascinating.
Yeah.
Because I was aware she was like kind of having this conversation in her own mind. And, it was kind of like it was an inner dialogue, and it was kind of her conscience, like Jiminy Cricket. And I found that whole thing very, very fascinating.
Do you think that's probably why you started working with avatars in your pieces?
Yes. I think that had a lot to do with it, because it was a way of exploring myself. Because I kind of realized, and maybe this is something that happens as we get older, is you start looking back on your life and you start wondering, like, how did I become this person that I am? And you start looking back and uncovering things and maybe there are things you've repressed. And, but you know, you start kind of wanting this self-knowledge and exploring it through avatars is a way that I think a lot of children, like Mr. Rogers always had these puppets to help kids understand their feelings. I think that I started working with avatars to help me understand myself.
And which one was your first avatar?
Well, I used figures. I used characters representationally in an earlier series before this, when I was painting these carousel horses. I did a whole series of paintings of those because I realized when I was looking at these carousels that some carousels looked very dramatic, like they were kind of really struggling. And there were these other carousels that looked like lighthearted and happy. And it was very obvious to me that these were made by different artists. And I explored that and realized that the avatars that looked like they were struggling were carved by Eastern European immigrant Jewish people when they came to America in the early part of the 20th century. And back in Eastern Europe, they used to carve synagogues, but there was no work for that in the States. So they got jobs at these carousel companies. And their horses looked like they were struggling. And I kind of realized that was in their ancestral DNA, this struggle. So those horses were kind of representing their own personal struggle. Whether they did that consciously, I don't think they did, maybe they did. So after that, you know, I kind of realized that I was using these horses as representing these people. And I decided to have a representation of myself in paintings, and that's my avatar, who I didn't make her, I found her in a thrift shop. She became my first avatar.
Do you typically find avatars, or do you make them yourself?
I typically make them myself. So a lot of the avatars you see in this painting, Refugees, I made all but 4 of those. And the ones that I didn't make came to me as gifts from very close friends. So those characters represent those people, which is similar to if you've ever gotten a gift from somebody and then every time you use that vase or you wear those earrings, it evokes that person. So it's kind of like that. It's almost like those objects become avatars for that relationship.
So do you think the likeness is important, or is it more of a focus on like the feeling you get from an avatar that like evokes the memory of the person?
I think there's definitely a vibe, but I also find when I'm making them, like this one of my son, like although my son is not like socks, doesn't look like socks, but there's something about that expression and that character that if you saw my son, you would say that obviously is him. Yeah. So it's a little of both.
Yeah. And I understand your process, you go through a few phases. So you have your avatars, you stage them, and then you go into your painting. Could you just go into a little more detail about the process?
Yeah. Usually when I am making an avatar, frequently it is made out of some objects or clothing that belong to that person. So like Aunt Rena, she is made out of her house coats that her son let me have. And the one in that painting, Heartstrings, of my husband, that's made out of his clothing. So I make the avatars, and then I pose them in different lighting situations and different settings. And I'll take, maybe a couple of 100 photos with different lighting and different settings. And I go through them and see if that's what I want to get from whatever feeling it is I want to express. So I make the avatars, I do a photo session, and from the photos, I make a composition for a painting. And it has to kind of work as a painting. And then I go on to the painting process, which is also kind of involved because I do either an underpainting that's in a grayscale value, and because watercolor is transparent, if I put the watercolor on top of the grayscale, then everything takes form.
So there's definitely a structure to your process. We were talking about this earlier too. How important is it to you that there's also an element of playfulness in the process? You're kind of going through it and figuring it out as you go along.
Well, I figure it out as I go along. Usually by the time I get to the painting process, I very much know what I want. I would say more of the creative process is coming before the painting process. But you have to leave yourself open during the painting process because stuff happens. I had this one wonderful painting. It was one of my own personal favorite paintings that I made, that I was working on it, and part of my studio is a balcony enclosure. So I'm working on this painting, and it's watercolor. And all of this, and it was really, really raining out. And before I knew it, the enclosure was leaking, and it's pouring water all over the painting, and all the paint is running, and because it's watercolor. And I was like, oh my God. And then I realized I'm not going to abandon this painting. If that happened, I'm going to go with it. And I did. And if anything, it kind of enhanced the painting. I think it's very important when stuff happens that you persevere. I guess Bob Ross would have said it's like a happy accident. But you know, you have to persevere.
Yeah, definitely. So you do work mainly in watercolor. I personally find that a very difficult medium. What draws you to using watercolor over another medium?
I have heard that a lot of people think watercolor is very challenging, but what I find about it, it's very flexible because it can be opaque, it can be translucent, it can be transparent. And I think that people that feel challenged by watercolor think that you only have to deal with it in this washy kind of way. But you don't. Because let's say, how I explain that I do a grayscale painting under the watercolor. So wherever you see that it's very dark, it's because there's a very dark gray under that. So it's not it's transparent. I mean, I like that flexibility about it. Or here, like with these guys, you see that texture. So I use acrylic brushes are much more bristly than watercolor brushes are very soft. So I use an acrylic brush because it's bristly. I dip it in the watercolor and I dab it on a rag so that I get the excess off. And for hours I go like dab, 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 dab. And I get that texture.
And I understand some of your pieces say that you use casing. And I had never heard of that before. Could you just tell us a little bit about what that is?
Yeah. You know, casing is the paint that frescoes were made from. And it's considered in the watercolor world, it's an acceptable medium, but there is a milk protein in there that when casing is totally dry, you could paint on top of it and it won't move, where watercolor will always move when you re-wet it. So I use that in certain circumstances where I know that I really don't want whatever's under it to move.
Do you ever delve into other mediums, or have you kind of just settled into your watercolor realm for now?
Do you mean with painting?
Any medium.
I do a lot of different mediums. I've done a lot of work with pastel, not oil pastel, soft pastel. You know, and once you've mastered watercolor, pastel is like child's play. You know. I actually think like once you've mastered watercolor, most other mediums are pretty much like child's play. So I've done pastel. I don't really care for acrylic, and the only time I've used that is when I've worked with kids to do theater sets. Because we had these flats, and we would reuse them year to year. And if we used a water-based paint, we couldn't reuse it. because we would whitewash it. And you can't do that with a water-based paint. So I used acrylic in certain circumstances. And I've done pen and ink. I do a lot of journaling with pen and ink and watercolor pencils. Sometimes I paint on black paper with gouache and gel pens. And gouache is a water-based paint, but it's opaque, where watercolor, which is all these, is transparent. I sew, I do sculpture. I've done ceramics when I've been in a situation where ceramics was available. You know, kind of like a musician just plays a lot of instruments. I do that. I do collage, I do book arts. I do a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I think that's great to not limit yourself as an artist. So a lot of your work is very playful when you first see it, but if you look at it for a little bit longer, there are some serious themes to some of it, and some like personal work going on. Is this an intentional contrast or balance that you try to strike in your pieces between playful and more serious themes?
Yes, I would say the themes are quite serious, but I know because I do these characters that they could be read in a very lighthearted way. You know, I think about the work of Klaus Oldenburg, and he, you know, made a monumental clothespin. And although that's very playful, I think he's also saying this little object that we take for granted and is not a serious object is actually very important in our lives. And by making it monumental, he's sort of saying this little object really has great value and is very important. We were talking about the seriousness of the themes. So, I think that people can approach this work on different levels, the way they can approach Oldenburg's work on different levels.
I actually really identified with the story that you have going on over here. It just kind of like, it's a moment to reflect on the like less ideal parts of yourself is what I got out of that. Do you want to go into that story a little bit?
Yeah, we could talk about this. This is a quite serious subject matter here. And, you know, I think that in my own personal search for self-knowledge, a few years ago, I kind of realized to myself that after that I have an eating disorder, and I've had it really ever since I can remember. But it wasn't until a few years ago that I said to myself, you know, Randy, you're not just a like picky eater or quirky eater, like you have like really a serious problem. And I was really wondering, like, why do I have this? And I was trying to figure it out, and I made these devils and demons and skeletons in my closet to kind of express how I got here and why do I have this. And I've kind of figured it out, but not enough that I don't have it. But I think that when you have something like that, it's kind of like being an alcoholic, and you're always kind of in recovery. So you never really don't have it. It's either sometimes it has more or less control over you than at other times. And that's what these paintings are about.
There really is like powerful vulnerability to a lot of your work. Why is it important for you to examine the difficult aspects of your life through your art?
Because I think that I'm trying to have a little more control over these things. And by doing that, I'm confronting those issues. Because once the issues are not a secret anymore, you're taking some power away. Like, just when things are secretive, part of the power is just that they are a secret. So once they're not, you have a little more control. Now I could, like, let's say somebody used to invite me over for lunch. Instead of me feeling like a panic attack and just saying, I can't. Now I say to them, I have this eating disorder, and maybe I'll be able to come, but I'm not sure that I'll be able to come. So if I say no, it's not because I don't like your cooking, or it's not because I don't like being with you. It's just because sometimes I can't do it. And if I feel I can't do it, maybe we could have coffee together. And in that way, I feel like, for one thing, I'm not insulting my friend for giving them some puzzling answer or making some lame excuse about why I can't come. I'm just like fessing up to it. And I feel like I'm trying to get a little control over those devils and demons by fessing up.
I really appreciate, as a viewer, that your work is very personal, but it's still relatable. How important is that for you, for your art to be not only vulnerable, but also relatable to an audience?
It's very important, because I think that even though I'm like telling you what's behind these, everybody has stuff in their closet that they want to deal with or have trouble dealing with. And if the work is too personal, then other people are not going to relate to it. So there has to be kind of a universal theme. And I felt like these addressed that. And I think that the Aunt Rena paintings, a younger person kind of dealing with an older person, learning from an older person, or us learning from each other, is a universal theme as well. So I think that if you don't do that, then the viewer's not going to have interest in your work if they can't relate to it at all.
And a lot of your work, specifically this wall and this wall, you have a very narrative quality to it, where it's almost like a comic book. It's like still images that go in a sequential order. Have you ever worked directly in a graphic novel format, or do you have any desire to?
Yes, I do. I do a lot of journaling, and that is very sequential. And I'm also working on a graphic novel, but that will take me a very long time. But that's in progress, has been for a couple of years. And what I decided to do was, because I love watercolor and I love painting, is to make my paintings like pages from a graphic novel. So these would all be panels. So that if this were set up in a different way, they could be like pages from a comic book. Because graphic novels are just like a fancy word for comic book, really. And I think that's a fabulous art form. It's very freeing and very flexible. There's a lot of painting groups where you go to show your work. They have a lot of restrictions about size, about subject matter, about... There are even some watercolor societies that will say, oh, you used Naples yellow in that painting, and Naples yellow is somewhat opaque, so that's not acceptable. You know, and when you're an artist, it goes against being an artist, you know, having these restrictions. And I feel like the world of graphic novels, it's like anything goes. Every page could be a different layout, or it could be one panel and another page could have several panels, or it could be like a panel within a panel. And I like that. And they could even be with narrative or without narrative. I read a lot of graphic novels, and some have no narrative. So I like that there's that flexibility.
And then for these works over here, I think earlier you were saying that you actually had more pieces and you like narrowed it down. Is that difficult for you to edit back your work once you're done with it?
It's very difficult, yeah, so. But I think that most artists are like that, you know, they just want everyone to see everything, and it was like, look at this thing I did when I was in high school.
Didn't it show promise?
And you did talk a lot about heartstrings when we spoke before. I was wondering if you wanted to go into any more detail behind that, because that's a strong story in itself too, even though it's just one singular image.
Yeah, that's a very strong story. I'm just going to take a look at it.
Go for it.
So heartstrings, that avatar is my husband, and he passed away in 2016. And we were together more or less for 40 years. We were married for a bunch of them. We were divorced for a bunch of them. And when I became very, very concerned about his health is when I moved out to Florida, because I felt that, and I always told him this after we split up, was when he really needed me around, I'd be around. So I was concerned about his health, so I retired from my wonderful teaching job in New York and sold my place and moved down to Florida. And he died very shortly thereafter, like 5 months later. And it was strange how I felt this urgency to retire and leave my job and come down. You know, I just felt it in my gut that he wasn't going to be around for long. So after he passed away, I made his avatar out of his clothes, and he had a very big persona. He was sort of like, I think Burl Ives played Big Daddy in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. I'm not sure if that was Burl Ives, but some actor with a very big persona. And my ex-husband, his name was Rick. He had that kind of personality where he walked into a room and he just commanded the room. He took all the oxygen out of the room. Like, I guess in a good way. I mean, in a powerful way. And me, who had kind of a passive personality, he was obviously the big figure in my life, so I'm like the little person there. And he, you know, we were very much, my relationship with him was kind of like a Stockholm Syndrome relationship. That's what that painting is about, because it was kind of a coercive, abusive relationship, which is illegal in the UK and in California, but it's not illegal yet in a lot of other states. And I think that, you know, you grow up and I think relationships are complicated, and that's what that painting is about.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that, and I'm wondering if there are any other pieces that you want to delve into a little bit deeper. Maybe this one behind you with the teacups.
Oh, I will. Yeah. But one last thing about the heartstrings. I really loved my husband and still love him very much. And this is his ring that I have here. And even though we were not together, it like didn't matter when we got divorced. Like we still communicated every single day for years, even though he got remarried. It was like nothing changed. Okay, so this painting over here, this is called Old Friends, and everything in that painting were gifts to me from old friends. So this little character here, this little knit character, is my friend Vivian. And she was the librarian at the school where I taught. And we're still good friends. And the teacups are from an artist friend of mine. And the vase with the flowers are from my friend Stephanie. So I think friendships are like really precious gifts, and that's kind of what that painting is about. I think friends are really important, and as you can see, I have my oldest friend here, so friends are very, very important. They're really part of the fabric of your life.
Again, I really appreciate the vulnerability behind your work. Do you ever get nervous putting so much out there for people to see, or is this like the most comfortable way to do it, do you think?
I like doing it because I would say putting yourself out there, it like makes you stronger. It's when you don't put yourself out there that you're not really facing things. So, and I think that your work shows emotion when you put stuff out there. And I mean, I see a lot of very skillful paintings. I mean, there's a lot of painters that have a tremendous amount of skill, but I don't see a lot of emotion frequently in a lot of that work. But that's just me, you know, that's art's very subjective.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me, for sharing your art with all of us. If anyone has any questions, I'll open the floor to you guys.
I have a question. You talked about the grayscale. Are you exposing any of the grayscale in the paintings, or do you end up covering everything up? I mean, do you use it as a back and forth for the color overlay?
Once I put the color on, sometimes I have to tweak the grayscale.
Mm-hmm.
I may have to make something darker. Sometimes I have to make something lighter, but that's pretty rare. I took a class in value drawing, plaster cast, and I learned for your work to really look voluminous, you have to use a full range. Like, let's say you have a pencil. In your painting, you have to have the darkest dark you can possibly do up until the lightest light, if you want your work to look voluminous. And I really keep that in mind when I'm working. I want the full range.
The thing that struck me the most when I first saw your work was the dimensionality of it. They feel physically deep, and that's helping me to understand how we get there.
Yeah, I start from the dark.
Mm-hmm.
I'll say to myself, let's say I'm working from a photo. I say, okay, what is the darkest thing in this image? And I make that the darkest I possibly can make it. And then I work toward the lightest. And where you see a totally white highlight, I'll use masking fluid, and I'll preserve those little spots. And then I do the whole painting and I remove the masking fluid. Sometimes I paint around things, but I find if I really, really wanna, in her shiny white, I'll masking fluid the lightest parts of that, like in the little beads on her headband there, and in the lightest lights. So I have to tweak it at the end, but when I do that grayscale underneath, I go from dark to light. And a lot of watercolorists work, most of them work from light to dark. I don't.
Can you talk about your refugees painting? Is that a statement about our current situation, or is it a statement about the characters and we're all from someplace else?
That is more what it's like, is that we're all refugees in this country, and we've come from all over, and the world is pretty migratory.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very much what this painting is about. And the reason it looks like the sea is parting is because I think that when people do this migration, you know, they're going for a better life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I did it with the parting sea. All these different people from all over.
It's really powerful.
So thank you.
Well done.
So I have a question. It's clear that there are pieces that aren't on the wall because it feels like a very in-depth exploration of your own experience. And that's certainly what artists are attempting to do. How much more of this story is there?
In this series of paintings, there were about 11 or 12 pieces. But when Christina pared it down, I think that she really took the important links.
Because it too is a very, not only personal story, but it is a representation of other people's experience too. Yours, like all of ours, is a replication of people who went before and are going to come after. There are universal truths in all of this, as well as very unique pieces that are special to all you and to all of us in our art. And I really enjoy the juxtaposition of both of them in these pieces, because I can see the universal, but I can also see the personal. And that's not always an easy sword to balance on.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Was there a question?
Oh, was there a question? Well, it was, yes, I'm sure. Are there more? And yes, there are.
Yes.
There are ties between some of these pictures that aren't here, and there's probably a few more with your aunt, and a few more with your family, kind of thing.
Oh, yeah.
And so, how many? I guess how many series of these is that the theme you've been using throughout your artistic career, or is this something that sort of came from your willingness to investigate your inner demons?
You're asking me about the sequential stuff?
It's more, as you started, was this your representation? I'm kind of asking, what was your early work compared to here? What were your themes there? Obviously they were similar, but maybe not exact, because this to me is something very considered, something that you've really pulled together for yourself, but also an attempt to connect to the viewer.
Yeah. My earlier pieces, I worked in series. And I did a whole series of these carousel horse paintings I was talking about. And then I've done some pieces that also had kind of avatars in them, but they were, I usually work in series. So there were the carousel horses. I worked on that for years, probably from starting around 2000 up until about 2012, maybe.
And that evolved into this.
Yeah, because once I realized that the horses were representing something, I thought that I needed to put myself personally in these pictures. And although I've done some self-portraits, I didn't want to do it that way. I felt like I could do it better this way.
Well, often if you use yourself or a person, the viewer can make it the story about that person,
Right.
and maintain that a little bit of distance from saying, well, that could be me. Well, we can say that can be me. The theme here is, I think that is us. It's
Yes.
just, this is my version of it. There's other versions, but we all have a universal experience.
That's what I was really hoping for. And, had that been me, I think that happens less than when you're using an avatar.
Right.
Well, Randy, thank you so much for speaking with all of us tonight.
Well, thanks everybody for coming.
Yeah, it was great to see you again.
It was a lovely experience.
Thank you.